the wind does not stop here. It moves across the earth like a heavy hand, pushing the flat terrain into an endless, rippling blur. To a stranger standing at the edge of the world, this place looks empty, a void. But if you stand still long enough, you begin to see that it is not empty at all. It is a green ocean, deep and dangerous, stretching from the edges of the Black Forest all the way to the mountains of the east. This is the steppe, the sea of grass, and to survive here you do not walk, you sail. The grass is tall, often higher than a man's waist. Thick and fibrous, it hides the uneven ground beneath it. It whispers as the wind hits it, a dry, rattling hiss that sounds like static. In the summer, the heat rises off the plains in shimmering waves, distorting the horizon so that distant herds of antelope look like they are swimming through the air. In the winter, the ocean freezes. The snow piles up, hard as stone, and the temperature drops so low that breath turns to ice in the air before it hits the ground. It is a hard place, a cruel place, but it is the only home they have ever known. We often think of the Mongols as land-bound people, but they understood the mechanics of this sea better than any admiral understood the Atlantic. The horse was their vessel, a creature bred over centuries to carry a rider across distances that would kill a man on foot. They did not just sit on these animals. They lived with them, fused to them. The stirrup was the invention that changed everything, allowing a warrior to stand in the saddle, to absorb the galloping rhythm of the beast, while his hands remained free to loose an arrow. The smell of leather and sweat was constant. The creak of the saddle was the sound of the day. But why this endless movement? Why the constant pressure against the borders of the world? We look at the maps and see arrows pointing west, armies swarming over cities, and we assume it was just bloodlust, greed, the desire for gold. But the earth tells a different story if you know how to listen to it. Scientists now drill deep into the lake beds of Mongolia, pulling up long, thin cylinders of mud. They look at the pollen trapped in those layers of silt, counting the grains, measuring the thickness of the sediment. It is a diary of the climate, and the diary from the early 13th century is terrifying. It shows a drought, a long, grinding drying of the land that turned the pasture into dust. The cattle starved. The sheep grew thin. The steppe, usually a generous mother, became a tomb. When the grass dies, the people move. It is not a choice. It is a law of physics. You cannot stay where there is no food. The herds must eat, or the herds die, and if the herds die, the people die. The conquests were not merely political campaigns orchestrated by a Khan in a tent. They were desperate, massive inhalation of resources. The Mongol machine was powered by the ecological panic of a drying world. They rode toward the walls of China and the rich cities of the West because the sea behind them was evaporating. Consider the sheer scale of this aquatic existence. There are no trees to break the wind, no stone walls to mark a boundary. You navigate by the stars, by the curve of a river, by the smell of a distant storm. The secret history, that ancient chronicle of their people, speaks of the land as if it were a living character. It talks of the bitter blue waters and the Black Forest. It understands that to lose your way on the steppe is to vanish. There are no landmarks here, just the endless, undulating green, and hidden within those waves were dangers that could swallow a tribe whole. Wolves, wild boars. The sudden thunderstorm turns the ground into a sucking mud within minutes. But the greatest danger was the isolation, the feeling that the sky is a heavy dome pressing down on you, and you are the only living thing for 100 miles. It creates a specific kind of psychology, a hyper-awareness, a need for order in the chaos. The grass itself was a weapon. It provided the forage for the horses that allowed the Mongol army to travel 50 miles in a day, while European knights plodded along on heavy grain-fed destriers that needed constant rest. The Mongol steppe pony could dig through the snow to find dry grass, eating almost anything, surviving on the worst terrain. This biological advantage was why they could appear on the horizon like a sudden storm and vanish just as quickly. The land fed the horse, and the horse fed the empire. But the land also demanded a terrible price. The winter of 1241, when the Mongols pushed into Hungary, was remembered by the locals as the Mongol invasion. But the Mongols remembered it differently. To them, it was just another season of the Sea of Grass. The ice was hard. The wind cut like a knife. They slept in the saddle, wrapping themselves in felt robes that froze stiff in the night. They ate dried meat and curd, washing it down with ice water or mare's milk. They did not feel the cold the way others did. They were part of it. The pollen samples show us the crisis. The secret history shows us the soul. Together, they paint a picture of people who did not conquer because they wanted to rule, but because they had to expand. The pressure of the population, combined with the shrinking of the pasture, created a kinetic energy that had to go somewhere. It slammed into the settled world like a tsunami. The wave started here, in the rustling, hissing grass, driven by a wind that never stops. Imagine standing on a low hill today. The silence is heavy. You hear the buzz of a grasshopper, the distant bark of a fox. It feels peaceful. But if you close your eyes, you can almost feel the vibration. Tamter of 10,000 hooves beating the earth, the shouts of commanders driving their men forward. The logic of the steppe is harsh and simple. Move or die. Consume or starve. The cities they encountered, the walled towns of the Russes, the great fortresses of the Khwarezmian Empire. These were islands in their ocean. Static, heavy, rooted in the ground. To a Mongol, a city that did not move was a violation of nature. It was a trap. And so they broke the traps. They tore down the walls and let the grass grow back over the ruins. They wanted the open space. They wanted the room to breathe. The relationship between the warrior and the ground was intimate. They knew the taste of the soil in different regions. They knew which plants would heal a wound and which would poison a horse. They read the clouds like we read street signs. This knowledge was their armor. It was their engineering. They did not need siege engines initially. They needed the stamina to ride until the enemy collapsed from exhaustion. And so the Sea of Grass birthed the monster. Or a miracle, depending on which side of the wall you stood on. The drying climate pushed them out, and the rich lands of the south pulled them in. It was a migration of catastrophic proportions disguised as a war. The arrows flew, the cities burned, but underneath the smoke and the screaming, there was always the quiet, relentless demand of the grass. Grow, feed, move. The wind picks up again now. It bends the stalks in unison, creating a rippling effect that looks like the scales of a giant dragon breathing. It is beautiful and terrifying. To understand Genghis Khan, you cannot look at the throne. You cannot look at the laws. You have to look here, at the dirt, at the roots, at the endless, hungry horizon that taught a boy named Temujin that if he did not swim, he would drown. The world was not a place to be owned. It was a place to be crossed, and the crossing had only just begun. If you were to walk into the high larch forests of the Congai Mountains today, you would find them silent. The trees stand like old, scarred sentinels, their bark rough against the palm of your hand. But if you were to take a hollow drill bit and twist it into the heart of one of these ancient trees, pulling out a long, thin cylinder of wood, you would find a map of time written in the rings, dark lines of winter, light lines of summer. Some lines are crushed tight together, whispering of years when the cold never broke. Others are wide, glistening with the memory of rain and sun. Neil Pedersen, a man who reads these wooden diaries, found a secret hidden in the trees of Mongolia. A secret that explains why the world suddenly turned upside down in the 13th century. For decades, we looked at the maps and saw only arrows. We saw a man named Temujin uniting the tribes and marching west. We saw genius. We saw brutality. But we missed the fuel. The trees tell us that before the conquests there was a gift. The years leading up to the rise of the Mongols were warm, wetter than usual, a strange, benevolent window of time that climatologists call the medieval warm period. It sounds gentle, it sounds pleasant, but in the steppe, pleasant weather does not mean picnics. It means grass. Endless, towering, nutrient-rich grass. And grass means horses. You have to understand the biology of this. A war machine in the 13th century was not made of steel and oil, it was made of bone and blood. The Mongol cavalry was the most advanced military technology on the planet, but it required an immense amount of fuel. A single horse needs roughly 30 pounds of forage a day to survive without supplemental grain. An army of 100,000 horses needs 3 million pounds of grass every single day. In a cold year or a dry year, that math does not work. The horses starve. The army walks. The conquest dies before it reaches the border. But during this warm period, the steppe exploded with life. The pollen buried in the lake beds confirms it. The grass grew high and thick, carpeting the plains in a layer of deep green that stretched to the horizon. It was a biological surplus. The mares grew fat on the rich summer grazing. They produced more milk. They foaled more often. The herds doubled, then tripled. It was a population boom of flesh and horsepower. Temujin did not just inherit a disorganized group of starving tribes. He inherited a stockpile of energy that had been accumulating in the soil for years. This abundance changed everything. It allowed the Mongols to do something that was previously impossible. They could maintain a standing army. Most steppe confederations were temporary. Men would gather, raid, and then scatter to find winter pasture for their animals. But with the climate on their side, the Mongols could keep their horses together. They could drill. They could sustain the massive logistical tail that followed every wing of their army. The spare horses, the remounts, the pack animals, they could all eat. The land itself was feeding the war. Think about the sheer physical reality of this. The smell of the steppe during these years would have been different. Not just the dry scent of dust, but the heavy, sweet smell of chlorophyll and fermentation. The ground would have felt spongy underfoot, the roots holding the water. For a young Mongol warrior, this was the golden age. The herds were so vast that a man could own 10, 20, or 50 horses and still not have enough rope to tie them all. Wealth was measured in the length of the line of animals outside your jur. The records from the Jin dynasty, the Chinese rulers to the south, hint at a creeping dread. Their scribes wrote of the Baryans multiplying like locusts. They saw the smoke of thousands of fires rising from the north. They assumed it was just chaos, but it was actually prosperity. The Jin reports complain of the Mongols' audacity, their ability to strike deep and then vanish. What the Chinese scholars did not understand was that the Mongols were riding on a wave of climate-driven prosperity. They were not scavenging. They were overflowing, and this biological surplus created a new kind of psychology. When you are starving, you are conservative. You risk nothing. You protect what little you have. But when you are fat, when your horses are strong and your quivers are full, you look outward. The pressure of the warm period pushed the Mongols to expand because they had the energy to do it. The economy of the steppe was suddenly booming, and the only currency they had to spend was violence. They needed to convert this biological capital, these horses, into political power before the weather turned. Consider the training of the horse archer. It takes years to learn to shoot from a galloping mount, to loose an arrow at the moment the horse's hooves are all off the ground, ensuring a steady platform. In a bad year, a boy has to spend his time helping his father dig for roots or hunt scarce game to survive. He does not have the luxury of practice, but in these years of plenty, the boys could ride from dawn until dusk. The surplus time allowed them to master the composite bow, to turn the hunt into a rehearsal for war. The warm weather gave them the time to become perfect killers. The trees remember this. The rings from the early 1200s are wide and confident, but they also hold a warning. The trees know that the warm period was an anomaly. a fleeting moment of grace in a harsh history. The Mongols knew it too, perhaps not in the scientific terms we use now, but in their bones. They knew the fact years never last. They knew winter always comes back. This created a frantic urgency. They had to move. They had to conquer while the grass was still high, while the horses were still strong. It was a race against the atmosphere. The contrast with the settled world could not have been more stark. In the cities of the south and the west, farmers relied on irrigation canals and predictable rainfall. A slight shift in the weather meant famine for them, but on the steppe, the warm period was a bonanza. While the Chinese emperors struggled with floods and droughts in their rice paddies, the Mongols were galloping across a sea of energy. They were biologically primed to dominate. It is strange to think that the fate of empires rested on the width of a tree ring. But history is not just about treaties and battles. It is about the rain. It is about the sun. It is about the temperature of the air. The Mongol war machine was a biological entity, a massive herd of grazing animals that needed a specific amount of calories to function. The medieval warm period provided those calories in excess. It was the invisible hand that placed the bow in the archer's grip and the saddle on the horse. And so they rode. The rich grass crunched under the hooves of 10,000 horses. The wind carried the scent of damp earth and wet manure. The warriors felt the strength in their legs and the power in their hands. They did not know about dendrochronology. They did not know about the Jin dynasty records. They only knew that the world was green, and the time was now. The climate had given them a sword, and they were going to use it before it rusted. The horizon was open, and for a brief, shining moment, the land itself seemed to be commanding them to go. Hold it in your mind, not as a weapon of war, but as a contradiction. A small, curved thing, barely longer than a man's arm, made of things that should not work together. It sits in the hand like a feather, yet it carries the weight of a continent's fall. This was the machine that broke the world, not the horse. Not the whip. The bow. To touch a Mongol composite bow is to touch a horrifying piece of engineering. It was not carved from a single stave of yew, like the simple weapons of Europe. It was a sandwich of biology, a violent collaboration of materials that hated each other. On the back, the side that faces the enemy, they glued strips of animal sinew, dried, stretched, and pounded until they were hard as wire. This sinew wants to snap back to its original length. It pulls. On the belly, the side facing the archer, they glued slivers of horn, usually water buffalo horn. This horn wants to resist compression. It pushes. In the middle, trapped between the pulling and the pushing, was a wooden core. Birch, larch, something to give it shape. They bound these layers together with glue made from fish bladders or hide, a sticky, foul-smelling paste that took months to cure. It was a balm made of patience. The smell of the workshop must have been suffocating. Dust from the ground horn mixes with the stench of boiling blue. The craftsmen who built these devices were not just artisans. They were chemists of death. They understood physics without having the words for it. They knew that when you pull the string, the sinew stretches and stores energy, while the horn compresses and stores more. When you let go, they both snap back to their resting state at the same time, propelling the arrow forward with a force that defies the size of the weapon. It is stored energy released in a microsecond. Consider the draw weight. A modern hunting bow might pull 60 pounds. A heavy English longbow, famous for its power, might pull 100. These Mongol bows routinely pulled 160 pounds. Imagine that. Imagine holding a grown man in your hand, suspending him by your fingertips, and then pulling him up to your face. That is the strength required to fire this thing. The archers did not just have strong arms, they had fingers twisted into claws by years of tension. Their thumbs were wrapped in heavy rings of bone, leather, or metal to protect the digit from the slicing force of the bowstring. The thumb ring was the point of contact, the fulcrum of the violence. Juvayni, a Persian historian who watched the Mongols dismantle his civilization, wrote about these weapons with a mix of fear and awe. He described them not as tools, but as extensions of the men who held them. He noted that the Mongols could shoot farther than anyone else. Their arrows could pierce armor at distances where other archers were just lobbing sticks into the air. The range was the terrifying part. A European knight, heavy in his plate mail, might look across a field and think he was safe. 300 yards away. That is a long way. But the Mongol bow could reach him. The arrow would arrive with a dull thud, punching through chainmail, through padding, through flesh and bone. The arrow itself was a marvel of efficiency. It had to be light to take advantage of that explosive release. They used birch or willow shafts, fletched with eagle feathers or vulture wings for stability in the wind. The heads were iron, shaped like broadheads for cutting flesh or bodkins for punching through armor. They carried different quivers for different jobs, one for long-distance harassment, one for the kill shot when the distance closes. They did not just shoot, they negotiated with distance. And the sound. It was not the twang of a Hollywood movie. It was a sharp, cracking report, like a whip snapping next to your ear. When 10,000 of these bows were loosed at once, the sound was a continuous tear in the fabric of the air. A ripping sound, then the hissing of the arrows in flight. Giovanni wrote that the arrows would darken the sky, hiding the sun. It sounds like exaggeration, a poet's flair. But when you do the math, when you calculate the rate of fire and the size of the armies, it becomes a possibility. A cloud of death is arriving faster than the human brain can process the danger. The tactical implication of this engineering was absolute. It meant the Mongols did not have to fight you. They did not need to swing a sword or crash into a shield wall. They could simply stay away. They could ride in circles around you just outside the range of your spears and pick you off one by one. It was a nightmare of asymmetry. The heavy cavalry of Europe or the infantry of China were built for the clash of bodies, the impact of steel. The Mongols denied them that satisfaction. They turned war into a distant, cold-blooded execution. The construction of the bow also dictated the rhythm of the campaign. These weapons were sensitive to humidity. The fish glue could soften in the rain. The wood could warp. This is why the Mongols hated the wet climates of the south and moved with such urgency. They carried the bows in leather cases to protect them from the damp. They treated them with the paranoia of a man guarding his own heart. If the bow failed, the man was just a rider on a horse, vulnerable, exposed. But as long as the glue held and the sinew was tight, they were gods of the steppe. Think about the training required to master this machine. A Mongol boy began to ride before he could walk. He began to shoot shortly after. By the time he was a man, the mechanics of the shot were burned into his nervous system. He did not aim, he just pointed. The paradox of the thumb draw. Using the thumb to pull the string instead of the fingers allowed for a cleaner release, a faster reload. The arrow rested on the thumb, ready to fly. It was a seamless motion. Reach, pull, loose. Reach, pull, loose. 6 arrows a minute. Per man. The psychological effect on the enemy must have been shattering. You stand in your formation. You hear the cracking sound. The man next to you falls without a scream, an arrow through his throat. You look for the enemy, but they are moving, blurring shapes at the edge of your vision. You cannot catch them. You cannot hurt them. You can only wait for the next arrow to find you. It was not combat. It was a slaughter, and it was all made possible by that intricate lamination of horn and wood. Archaeologists have found these bows in the frozen tombs of the Mongol steppe, preserved by the ice. Even after centuries, the layers are visible. The sinew, the horn, the wood. They look like modern composites, like something made in a lab with carbon fiber. But this was biology. They took the parts of dead animals and turned them into a weapon that could rewrite the map of the world. It is a testament to the obsession with function. Nothing was there for decoration. Every layer, every drop of glue, every curve of the limb served one purpose: To drive a shaft of wood through a human being from a distance that felt safe. The silence that followed the volley was the worst part. The horses would wheel and gallop away. The dust would settle, and the field would be filled with the groans of the dying. The Mongols would return later to finish the work with swords and lances. But the real killing had already happened. The composite bow had done its work, a small, handheld engine of destruction that turned the art of war into a science of distance and ballistics. They were holding the future in their hands, and it was curved like a crescent moon. Imagine a book that does not want to be read, a manuscript written in a code that was almost lost, hidden away for centuries by the very people it was meant to honor. This is the secret history of the Mongols. It is not a dry chronicle of dates and treaties. It is the only mirror the Mongols ever held up to themselves. While the rest of the world was busy writing about the devil who rode from the east, this book was whispering about the man who sat by the fire, worried about his sons, and remembered the taste of bitter roots in a starving winter. Most of what we know about Genghis Khan comes from his victims. The Persian historians, men like Rashid al-Din or Juvaini, wrote with trembling hands. They described a scourge of God, a monster sent to punish the sins of the world. The Chinese scribes wrote of barbarians, of uncouth beasts who destroyed civilization. They looked at the burning cities and the piled skulls and saw only evil. But the secret history is different. It was written by the Mongols, for the Mongols, and because of that, it contains a terrifying truth. It shows us that the monster was a human being. The text begins not with a war, but with a birth. It tells of a gray wolf and a fallow doe, but then it grounds itself in the dirt. It introduces us to a boy named Temujin. He is not a conqueror here. He is a frightened child clutching a coat of white fur, staring at the frozen body of his father. The history lingers on the grief. It describes the way his mother, Hualun, had to dig for roots in the hard earth to keep her children from starving. It tells us that the great Khan was once a scavenger. This detail changes everything. When you read the Persian accounts, you wonder how a man could be so cruel. When you read the secret history, you understand. Cruelty was a survival mechanism. It was forged in the cold when the tribe left them behind to die. There is a moment in the text that feels like a punch to the gut. It is the story of the first murder. Temujin and his brother Khazar kill their older half-brother Bektar. It is not a battle. It is an execution over a fish and a lark. The history describes the ambush in the tall grass. The arrows fly. Bektar sits on the hill and accepts his fate, telling them not to kill his little brother. It is a scene of shocking intimacy. The text does not condemn Temujin. It does not praise him. It just records it. This is the psychological portrait we have been denied by other sources. The Khan was a man who learned early on that violence was the only way to control his own destiny. The silence of the steppe after that arrow struck must have been deafening. The voice of the secret history is erratic. It shifts from high poetry to crude insults in a single breath. It captures the rhythm of the campfire. 1 minute, the text is reciting a majestic genealogy linking the Khan to the blue sky. The next is recording a fight between two generals, where one calls the other a shower of urine. This is the texture of the real world. The Persians would never record such vulgarity. They were trying to write a history of the world. The Mongol scribe was trying to write down the truth of the people. He recorded the bad jokes, the petty arguments, and the specific smells of the tent. And then there is the tragedy of Jamuka. The Persian chronicles tell us that Genghis Khan had a rival and that he defeated him. Simple, clean. But the secret history breaks your heart with this story. Jamuka was Temujin's blood brother, his Anda. They swore an oath as boys, exchanging knuckle bones and arrows. History remembers the warmth of that friendship. But the world pulled them apart. Jamuka wanted the old ways, the aristocracy of the steppe. Temujin was building a meritocracy. When they finally meet for the last time, The dialogue is painful to read. Jamuka asks to be executed without blood being spilled. He asks for a proper death. The text shows us Temujin's hesitation. It shows us the pain of killing a friend. It is a far cry from the image of the ruthless butcher. It is the saddest political divorce in history. We have to remember that this book was dangerous. It was likely written shortly after Genghis Khan's death, perhaps for the royal family to read privately. It contains things that were not meant for outsiders. It criticizes Khan's sons. It calls them foolish and weak. It worries about the future of the empire. Imagine a historian today writing a private book for the president's children, telling them that their father was great, but that they are ruining everything. That is the secret history. It is honest to a fault. The language itself is a ghost. It was written in the Mongolian script using Chinese characters, a weird hybrid that reflects the collision of cultures. The scribe who wrote it was likely a man who remembered the old oral stories. He wrote them down before they vanished. You can hear the oral rhythm in the repetition. Phrases repeat like a mantra. The hooves thundered, the hooves thundered. It is meant to be spoken aloud, not read silently in a library. It is a spell meant to summon the past. Because we have this text, we can see the gap between the man and the myth. The world saw the lightning. The secret history shows us the cloud. It tells us of Genghis Khan's fear of the shaman, Kokochu, who tried to steal his power. It describes how the Khan's wife, Borte, was kidnapped, and how he raised a son, Jochi, who might not have been his. The uncertainty of that paternity hangs over the text like a storm cloud. It explains the later rifts in the family. The Persian writers don't know about Jochi's doubtful birth. They don't know why the brothers fought. The secret history knows. It was always about the blood. The text also serves as a manual for the law. The Yasa. It tells us why Genghis Khan traditionally banned the slaughtering of animals, slitting the throat and letting them bleed out. He forbade it because he believed the blood belonged to the spirit of the earth. You had to open the chest and stop the heart. It is a gruesome detail, but it shows us a man who was obsessed with order, even in the way life was taken. The outsider saw savage prohibition. The insider saw spiritual necessity. To read the secret history is to sit in the tent with the old warriors. You can smell the mare's milk. You can feel the grease on the leather. You can hear the wind howling against the felt walls. The text admits to the massacres. It does not deny the mountains of bones, but it explains the logic behind them. It was not madness. It was a cold, calculated attempt to create a world where no Mongol child would ever have to eat a rat again. It was a harsh utopia. The book eventually vanished from history. The Mongols lost the script. The Chinese kept it hidden in their imperial archives, classified as a dangerous document. It was not until the late 19th century that a Russian scholar found a copy and realized what it was. It is a miracle that we have it at all. Without it, Genghis Khan would just be a shadow, a monster in the dark. With it, he becomes a tragic figure, a man who loved his friends, feared his gods, and killed anyone who stood in the way of his people's survival. The voice in the pages is calm. It is not boastful. It speaks of the Khan as Genghis only after he earned the title. Before that, he was just Temujin, a man who lost his father, lost his wife, lost his best friend, and kept going until the world bent to his will. The secret history does not ask us to forgive him. It just asks us to see him, to see the human face beneath the iron mask. It is the only autobiography of a conqueror that admits he was afraid. And in that admission, it finds a strange kind of peace. The wind blows through the pages now. The voices are silent, but the story remains. A whisper of a world that tried to burn itself clean. The mares were heavy, their bellies swollen low with the life of the next generation, their udders distended, dragging near the ground. For any other army, this would be a logistical nightmare. A burden. For the Mongols, it was the calendar. You did not look at the sun to decide when to go to war. You looked at the animals. If the mares were foaling, you stay put. You did not ride. You did not kill. You guarded the grass. This was the first law of the steppe, written not in ink but in the biology of the herd. The conquest of the world was paused so that a foal could learn to stand on wobbly legs. William of Rubruck, a Franciscan friar who stumbled into the Mongol camps in the 1250s, was completely baffled by this. He came from a world of stone walls and church bells, where time was measured by the canonical hours. He looked for the general's tent. He looked for the marching orders. He found only a sprawling, chaotic city of felt that moved with the slow, deliberate pace of a grazing animal. He wrote in his journal that they had no fixed schedule, that they moved as it pleased them. But he was wrong. They moved as the grass pleased them. They moved as the rivers froze and thawed. The rhythm of their war was the heartbeat of the earth. Consider the spring. It sounds lovely in poetry. The melting snow, the green shoots. On the steppe, spring was a dangerous, filthy trap. The ground turned into a bottomless soup of mud. The hooves of the horses would sink, tearing up the tender new roots, destroying the pasture before it could grow. And the foals. They were everywhere, slippery, wet, confused. The mares were fierce, protective, unpredictable. To try to maneuver a cavalry formation during foaling season would be to destroy your own army from the inside out. The noise alone would give you away. The high-pitched whinnies of the foals, the nickering of the mothers. So they waited. They endured the mud and the biting wind, conserving their energy, letting the enemy believe they were far away. The heat was a physical weight pressing down on the endless plains. The grass grew tall, turning from a bright neon green to a deeper, darker shade. The horses began to recover their strength. They gorged themselves on the rich forage, putting on layer after layer of fat. You could see it in the sheen of their coats. The riders were busy too. This was the season of the mare's milk. Kumis, the fermented drink that fueled the empire. Rubruck tasted it and recoiled, describing it as having the savor of cow's milk, but with a pungent, alcoholic kick that made his head spin. He watched them churn it in leather bags, separating the froth. This was not just a drink, it was their fuel. But even in summer they were cautious. The heat exhausted the horses. A long chase in July could kill a mount through dehydration. They were saving themselves for something else. The waiting was part of the strategy. While the settled civilizations of China and Persia plotted and schemed behind their walls, the Mongols were following the biological dictates of their livestock. They were shepherding their resources. A general in Europe might look at a map and say, "We attack in September." A Mongol general looked at his horses and said, "Can they run for 3 days without water? If not, we wait." It was a patience that drove their enemies mad. The enemy would muster an army, wait for an attack that never came, and then have to disband because the harvest was ready, or winter was coming. The Mongols were always there, just over the horizon, grazing. And then the air would change. August would turn to September. The nights would get cold enough to frost the tents in the morning. This was the moment, the trigger. The grass had cured, turning into a dry, nutritious hay standing in the fields. The horses were at their peak, sleek, muscular, bursting with the stored energy of the summer grazing. The fat pad on their rump was hard and high. Now. It had to be now. This was the season of the autumn campaign. The timing was not accidental. It was a calculation of calories and distance. The autumn wind had a specific sound. It rattled the dry seed heads. It carried the scent of snow from the north. The Mongols would break camp. The jurs would be collapsed and loaded onto carts. The herds would be gathered, and they would move. Not as a mob, but as a synchronized wave. They rode with the seasons at their backs, using the cooling weather to keep the horses from overheating during the rapid advances. They could cover astonishing distances in the fall because the ground was hardening, the flies were gone, and the horses were machines of pure conversion. Grass into speed. Speed into terror. William of Rubruck noticed the strange order within the chaos. He saw that despite the lack of visible ranks, every family knew its place. The cart of the blacksmith, the herd of the princess, the spare horses of the heavy cavalry. It was a moving inventory. But the driving force was always the condition of the pasture. They fought wars to find better grass. They invaded Hungary, not just for the plunder, but because the pastures of the puszta looked like home. They moved into the fields of the Russes because the river valleys were lush. The geography of the empire was drawn in green, not in red. Winter, the dead season, was when the Mongols became truly terrifying to the outsiders. In Europe, winter was when armies went into quarters. You didn't fight in the snow, you hid by the fire. But for the Mongols, winter was an opportunity. The rivers froze solid. The Danube, the Volga, the Shajothes were obstacles that stopped armies. To the Mongols, they were highways. The ice was smooth, flat, and harder than dirt. They could ride sleds and light cavalry across bridges of ice that no engineer could build. Rubruck wrote about the cold with horror, describing how his breath froze on his beard, how the wine in his flask turned to slush. The Mongols just wrapped themselves in thicker felt, greased their faces against the frost, and kept riding. The winter coat of the horse grew long and shaggy. The hooves hardened against the ice. The army became more mobile, not less, because the mud was gone. The ground was iron. They could strike anywhere at any time, appearing out of the white haze like spirits. The enemies, huddled in their cities, watching the snow pile up, believed they were safe. Nature was on their side, they thought. But nature was neutral, and the Mongols had learned to wear the cold like a cloak. There is a dark beauty to this synchronization. The entire military apparatus was an extension of the natural world. They did not try to dominate the environment. They flowed with it. They used the thaw to hide, the summer to feed, the autumn to strike, and the winter to cross boundaries that were supposed to be uncrossable. It was a perfect system, provided the grass held out, and when it didn't, when the droughts came or the zooed winters buried the pastures in ice, the system broke. But in the years of the conquest, the rhythm was perfect. Imagine the sound of the autumn advance, a low rumble that vibrated in the ground. No shouting, no bugles, just the sound of 10,000 hooves eating up the miles, the creak of leather, the heavy breathing of the horses. The riders were silent, scanning the horizon, reading the wind. They knew that soon the snow would fall. They knew that the rivers would freeze. They knew exactly how far a horse could run on a belly full of autumn grass. It was a knowledge so deep it was instinct. They were not conquering the world. They were just migrating, and the world happened to be in the way. The seasons turned, the grass grew, and the arrows flew. All of it connected. All of it inevitable. The scream cut off abruptly. That was the sound that mattered. Not the shouting, not the weeping of the women, not the prayers in languages God did not understand. It was the moment the noise stopped. On the steppe, before the law came, the noise never stopped. A man killed your brother, so you killed his cousin. He burned your tent, so you stole his horses. Back and forth, an echo of violence that stretched back centuries, long before the first stone was laid in the cities of the South. It was a hum of blood feud that never slept. Then the Yasa arrived, and the screaming stopped. The Yasa. The word hangs in the air like smoke. It means the law, the decree, the order. But to say it is just a set of rules misses the point. It was a machine for turning chaos into silence. Rashid al-Din, the Persian historian who had access to the locked archives of the Ilkhanate, wrote that Genghis Khan sat alone in his tent, scribbling these laws on scraps of parchment, dictating them to scribes until dawn. He was building a skeleton for a body that had been shapeless mush. Before the Yasa, a man was only as safe as his own sword arm made him. After the Yasa, a man was safe only if he obeyed, and the obedience had to be absolute. The logic was brutal and mathematically simple. If you steal, you die. If you commit adultery, you die. If you lie, you die. Even for small things. A sheep, a loaf of bread. It did not matter. The punishment was the same. There were no prisons on the steppe. You could not lock a man in a stone box when you were migrating 1,000 miles. You either walked with the tribe, or you stopped walking forever. The Yasa removed the variable of mercy. It turned justice into a binary equation, 1 or 0. Alive or dead. Consider the sheer weight of this change. In the old days, if a warrior from a different tribe spilled your milk, it was an excuse for a raid. A feud that would last 3 generations. Under the Yasa, that spill was a crime against the order. The Khan owned the vengeance now. You could not raise your hand. You had to take the insult to the judge, and if the judge said the man was innocent, you went home and you swallowed your anger. If you didn't, if you took your own revenge, the Yasa killed you too. It cut the cords of tribal loyalty and replaced them with a single iron wire that ran straight back to the Khan. Al-Malik al-Ashraf, a Syrian sultan who fought the Mongols and tried to understand them, wrote about their discipline in his military treatises. He noted that they did not fight for God or for country. They fought because the code demanded it. The Yasa told them how to eat. You could not stick a knife into the meat. You had to cut it with your fingers. It sounds small, manners. But on the steppe, sharing food was sharing life. To eat alone was to declare yourself an animal. The law forced an intimacy that kept the army from fracturing. And then there was the hygiene. The Arabs and Persians found it baffling. The Mongols were forbidden from washing their clothes in running water. They believed it would poison the water, angering the spirits. They would not put their hands in a dish of water that others had used. They carried their own spoons. These were not just quirks. In a camp of tens of thousands where disease could wipe out an army faster than any enemy arrow. These laws were survival tactics disguised as religion. You did not drink the water that someone had washed their hands in. You did not touch the dead. The Yasa was a manual for staying alive in a dirty world. The most terrifying part of the code was the equality, not the kind we think of today. It was a flat, terrifying equality of consequence. The prince of the blood in the stable hand stood before the Yasa as the same creature. If a noble stole a horse, he was executed just like a commoner. Rashid al-Din tells the story of Shugatu Kutu, the adopted son of Genghis Khan, who was a judge. He ruled against a powerful general. The general complained. Khan laughed. He said the judge was right. The law was the Khan. The Khan was the law. To break one was to break the other. This was the glue. It held the empire together when the personality cult of Genghis faded. The machine kept running. Religion was swallowed by this logic too. The Muslims prayed to Allah. The Christians prayed to Christ. The Buddhists sat in silence. The Mongols did not care. They cared about order. The Yasa promised religious freedom, but only in exchange for taxes and obedience. You could worship anything you wanted as long as you bowed to the authority of the Khan first. Al-Malik al-Ashraf noticed that the Mongols would often pray to the sky before a battle, asking for victory, but their real faith was in their discipline. Their prayer was the formation, their church was the marching column. The enforcement of the Yasa created a specific kind of silence in the conquered territories. It was the silence of fear, but also the silence of exhaustion. People stopped fighting each other because they were too afraid of what the Mongols would do if they did. The highways became safe. A woman could walk from the Yellow Sea to the Black Sea with a golden dish on her head, and no one would touch her. It sounds like a paradise, but the cost was the death of the soul. You were safe, but you were not free. You were a component in a vast engine of order. Imagine standing in the marketplace of a sacked city. The bodies are still being cleared from the streets. The smell of blood is fading, replaced by the smell of refuse and unwashed bodies. A Mongol officer rides in. He does not shout. He does not wave a sword. He just reads the decree. The yasa is now the law of the land. No stealing, no killing. The penalty is death. The people who have just watched their world burn nod. They accept it. Because the chaos was worse. The yasa was a monster. But it was a monster that protected you from the smaller monsters. The code even dictated how the Khan himself should behave. He was not above the law in his own mind, though in practice he was the source of it. But he had to maintain the persona of the enforcer. He slept on the ground. He ate the same food as the lowest soldier. He wore simple clothing. It was a performance of equality that reinforced the logic of the law. We are all the same under the blue sky. We all answer to the same voice. That voice was the voice of the yasa. It was not written down in a massive book for everyone to read. It was memorized. It was recited by the judges at the festivals. It was whispered in the tents. It was a secret code that you had to learn to survive. If you didn't know the law would kill you. And you wouldn't even know why. You would just see the executioner raise his blade and then the darkness. The genius of Genghis was not that he was the strongest fighter. It was then that he understood that uncontrolled strength is just energy waste. He focused the energy. He funneled the rage of 1,000 tribes into a single channel. The yasa was the channel. It turned a riot into an army. It turned a migration into an invasion. It took the messy, beautiful, terrible chaos of the human condition and forced it into a straight line. Rashid al-Din wrote that the yasa was so sacred that even after the Mongol Empire fragmented, the descendants of Genghis still feared breaking it. They would kill each other over territory, but they would not eat alone. They would not steal a horse. The ghosts of the laws were louder than the living men. The logic had seeped into the soil. The empire fell apart, but the order remained in the minds of the people. A ghost that still walked the steppe long after the horses had gone. The wind blows through the grass now, and there is no one to enforce it. But the silence remains, heavy, absolute, waiting. 10 men. That is all it took to break the world. Not 10,000, not 1,000,000, just 10. Standing in a line, shoulder to shoulder, looking at the same point on the horizon. Before this, a man looked to his left and saw his cousin. He looked to his right and saw his uncle. He was safe because of the blood. He fought because of blood. But Genghis Khan saw the weakness in that. Blood is thick. Blood is messy. Blood creates factions. So he dissolved the blood. He replaced it with a number. Imagine the day the order came down. The camp was a sprawling maze of kinship groups, a tangled knot of families who had hated each other for centuries. The Taijuds hated the Kuraits. The Naimans looked down on everyone. Then the messengers arrived. They did not ask who your father was. They did not care what your clan totem was. They pointed at you. And then they pointed at 9 strangers. A Taichud archer, a Kuraid herdsman, a Naiman smith, a Chinese deserter, a Muslim merchant, you 10. You are now an Arban. Yuan Shi, the dynastic history of the Mongols in China, records this reorganization as a bureaucratic administrative change. But on the ground, it must have felt like a kidnapping. You were ripped from your family tent and thrown into a squad with men you might have been raiding last week. You did not trust them. You did not know their jokes. You did not know if they would hold the line or run. But you were bound to them now, not by love, but by the law of the 10. If one of you ran, the other 9 were killed. If one of you stole, the other 9 were punished. You suddenly had a very vested interest in the behavior of the stranger sleeping next to you. This was the Arban, the base unit of the Mongol world. From there, the structure built itself upward like a grim pyramid of stone. 10 Arbans made a zun, 100 men, a company, a century. The commander of this unit was not chosen because he was the chief's son. He was chosen. He was strong. He was smart. because he could make 100 strangers move like one body. It was the first meritocracy the steppe had ever seen. Your last name did not matter. Your skill did. Minhaj-e-Siraj Juz-Jani, a Persian historian who hated the Mongols and feared them, wrote about this organization with a grudging respect. He noticed that they did not fight like the other armies. The Arabs and the Persians fought in masses, a mob of individuals striking out. The Mongols moved in geometry. A zoom could split in half, reform, turn, and wheel with a precision that was unnatural. It was like watching a machine made of flesh and bone. The machine worked because the parts were standardized. Then came the Mingan, 1,000 men, a regiment. This was where the tribal identity really began to dissolve. 1,000 men from 10 different tribes, speaking 5 different languages, all wearing the same rough coat of sheepskin, all riding the same type of sturdy horse. They trained together every day. They ate together from the communal cauldron. Over time, the hatred of the other faded, replaced by a cold, hard loyalty to the unit. You did not fight for the charades anymore. You fought for your Mingan. You fought for the standard bearer in front of you. And at the top, the terrifying apex of the structure, was the Tumen. 10,000 men. A division, an army in itself. When a Tumen moved, the earth shook. It was a self-contained ecosystem. It had its own herds of spare horses trailing behind like a floating island of livestock. It had its own engineers, its own blacksmiths, its own cooks, its own medical staff. A Tumen could operate independently for months, cut off from the main force, and still function perfectly. It was a virus that could survive anywhere. The genius of this decimal system was that it erased the map. The old tribal leaders, the Noyans and the Khans who claimed power by birthright, were stripped of their followers. Genghis Khan did not just kill his enemies. He neutered them. He took their people and reassigned them to loyal commanders. A former chief might find himself a common soldier in an arban, taking orders from a low-born peasant who had risen through the ranks because he was good with a bow. The humiliation must have been absolute. The silence in those new formations must have been heavy with resentment and fear. But the efficiency was undeniable. When the command came down from the Khan, it passed through the Tumen commander to the Mingan commander, to the Loon commander, to the leader of the Arban. It was a game of telephone that never distorted the message. 10,000 men could change direction in a heartbeat because the signal only had to travel through 4 simple links. There was no debate. There was no council of elders. There was only the order and the execution. Juz-Jani wrote that the Mongols were like demons in their discipline. He didn't understand that they were just mathematics. The decimal system allowed for endless expansion. When a new city was conquered, its survivors were not slaughtered or sent away. They were absorbed. 1,000 Persian engineers could be slotted into a Mingan of Chinese sappers. A unit of Arab horsemen could become a Zun within a Mongol Tumen. The architecture of Tans was a universal adapter. It could take any human material and fit it into the machine. Imagine the sound of a Tumen on the march, not the chaotic clatter of a rabble, but a low, rhythmic thrum. The hooves of 10,000 horses hit the dirt in a rolling beat. The creak of the leather saddles. The jingle of the bits. There was the sound of a factory moving across the plain. Every man knew his place. Every man knew his count. If the arrow order was given, the first rank loosed, the second rank loosed, and the third rank loosed. A rhythm of violence. 1, 2, 3. Reload. 1, 2, 3. Reload. 1, 2, 3. Kill. The psychological impact on the individual soldier was profound. He lost his history. He became a cog, but in exchange he gained a terrifying new power. He was no longer a helpless member of a small tribe that could be wiped out by a rival clan. He was part of a Tumen. He was part of 10,000 brothers. The feeling of invincibility that came from that mass of humanity must have been addictive. You could ride into the mouth of hell because you knew the 9 men behind you were riding too. The structure also solved the problem of logistics. The herds were divided by tens, hundreds, and thousands too. Every arban was responsible for a specific group of sheep or goats. If an animal died, the 10 men answered for it. This forced the soldiers to be caretakers as well as killers. They guarded the livestock with the same intensity they guarded their weapons. The army ate its way across the world, and the decimal system ensured the food was always where it needed to be. It was a cold way to organize a life. No romance, no glory of the ancestors, just the cold, hard math of survival. The Yuan Shi lists the titles and the numbers, dry and factual. But behind those numbers is the story of a complete social overhaul. It was the destruction of the old world to build a frame for the new one. The tribes were gone. The clans were ghosts. There were only 10. The 100, the 1,000, the 10,000. And when they died in their numbers. An arban was wiped out in a skirmish. A zun was crushed in a breach. A mingan lost to disease. The machine just kept grinding. New parts were slotted into the empty spaces. The decimal system made the men interchangeable, replaceable. That was the horror and the beauty of it. The individual did not matter. The number mattered. The formation mattered. The line moved forward, always forward, counting its steps in the blood of the fallen, marching to the beat of a silent drum that only the Khan could hear. 10 men, one purpose, the end of everything they knew. The most important piece of equipment in the Mongol army was not the composite bow. It was not the scimitar or the steel helmet. It was the leather bag tied to the saddle. Empty, it was light and folded small. Full, it was a life raft. Inside that bag was neither water nor wine. It was sour, white, frothing mare's milk. It was called kumis, and it was the fuel that burned hotter than anything the world had ever seen. You have to understand the sheer strangeness of this to a European observer. A Franciscan friar, maybe William of Rubruck or one of his unlucky companions, would watch in horror as a Mongol warrior reached under his horse, squeezed the teats, and drank the warm milk straight from the source. It looked barbaric. It looked dirty. But the friar was missing the point. The horse was not just a vehicle. It was a walking, breathing, self-replenishing factory of calories. Every mare in the herd was a moving canteen. The Mongol army did not need to carry water wagons. They did not need to follow the rivers. They carried their water in the blood of their herds. The process of making kumis was a violent chemistry that happened on the move. They would milk the mares into a large leather sack, usually made from the hide of a cow or an ox. Then they added a starter culture, a chunk of old fermented curd from the day before, and they sealed the bag. The churning was automatic. As the horse galloped, the sack bounced against the saddle. The constant agitation mixed the milk with the bacteria. By the time the sun went down, the mild, sweet milk had transformed into a potent alcoholic acid. It bubbled, it hissed when they opened the plug. It smelled like yeast and sweat and unwashed animals. The missionaries wrote letters home trying to describe the taste. They said it made the lips pucker and the head spin. It was an acquired taste, sharp and biting, but it did the job. It provided protein. It provided sugar. It provided hydration, and most importantly, it provided a slight buzz that numbed the pain of riding 12 hours a day. A warrior could live on kumis for weeks. It was the ultimate logistical trick. The supply train was organic. It grazed on the steppe, reproduced itself, and waited patiently to be milked. But milk was not enough for the hard riding of a campaign. They needed meat, and they needed meat that would not rot. The Mongols did not have time to salt-cure pork or smoke hams in smokehouses. They cured their meat with the wind and the sun. It was called borts. They would take a horse or a cow, usually an animal that had broken a leg or milking mares that had dried up, and slice the meat into long, thin strips. They hung these strips on lines made of horsehair, flapping in the bitter wind of the steppe. The air in Mongolia is so dry and the sun so intense that the meat desiccates almost instantly. It loses all its moisture. It shrinks down to a fraction of its weight. 100 pounds of fresh meat would turn into 10 pounds of hard, brown jerky. You could carry a week's worth of protein in your pocket. It was as hard as a rock. To eat it, you had to put it against your gums and let it soften with saliva, or you would crush it between two stones and boil the powder into a soup. It tasted like dust and iron, but it kept the muscles hard. The Franciscans complained about this food constantly. In their letters, they begged for bread. They dreamed of a soft loaf of wheat baked in an oven. To them, the Mongol diet was a starvation diet. They saw the warriors gnawing on strips of dried leather and drinking fermented milk, and they saw poverty. But they were wrong. They were looking at the most efficient military diet in history, while a European knight needed a wagon train of flour, wine, and preserved meat to move a mile. The Mongol warrior carried his entire pantry on his hip. He was free. He could scout. He could raid. He could vanish. The secret history tells the story of the dark years, the time before the empire when Temujin and his family were living like wild animals in the wilderness. It talks about digging for roots. It talks about fishing with needles. It talks about eating rats and marmots. That hunger never really left them. Even when they ruled the world, they ate like they were one bad harvest away from death. The borts were not just food, it was insurance. It was a memory of the starvation that drove them out of the mountains in the first place. And when the hunting was bad, or when the herds were thin, the rules of the kitchen changed. The border between the rider and the horse blurred. A horse was a friend. A horse was a brother. But a horse was also emergency rations. The Mongols knew exactly how much meat was on a horse. They knew how much blood a mare could lose before she collapsed. In a true pinch, they would cut a vein in the horse's neck, drink the warm, salty blood, and seal the wound back up with clay. It was a horrific intimacy, drinking the life force of the animal that carried you. The mission records mention this with a shudder. They could not understand the bond. To them, the horse was a beast of burden. To the Mongol, the horse was a survival partner. You shared the heat of its body on a freezing night. You drank its milk. You ate its flesh. It was a total consuming relationship. There was no waste. When a horse died, the hide became armor or water bags. The tendons became bowstrings. The bones were cracked open for the marrow. The hooves were boiled down into glue. Every part of the animal was transformed into war material. This self-sufficiency terrified their enemies. A conventional army could be defeated by burning its supply depots. If you burned the Mongol supplies, they just looked at you with confusion. Their supplies were walking around beside them. You can't burn a herd. You can't starve an army that is eating its way across the map. The cities they besieged would eat their own dead before the Mongols ran out of food. The psychological weight of that reality was crushing. The defenders were trapped in a stone cage, eating leather boots. The attackers outside were feasting on mare's milk and dried horse meat. Even the way they hunted was a rehearsal for these logistics. The Nurge was the great circle hunt. Thousands of riders would form a ring miles wide and slowly close in, driving every animal within the circle toward the center. It was not for sport. It was to secure meat for the army. It was a way to gather thousands of pounds of protein in a single day without slowing down the march. The animals were driven in, slaughtered, and processed right there on the spot. The campfires would burn all night as the meat was dried. The air smelled of roasting fat and singed hair. The friars, watching from the edge of the fire, must have felt very far from home. They missed their bread. They missed their vegetables. They looked at the greasy faces of the warriors, the crust of dried milk on their mustaches, the pieces of meat stuck in their teeth, and they saw an army of savages. But those savages were riding circles around the civilized world. They were fueled by a diet that made them lean, mean, and terrifyingly mobile. They could cross a desert in days because they didn't need to carry water. They could cross a mountain range because they didn't need to carry food. It comes down to the bag. The simple leather bag, slapping against the saddle with every gallop, mixing the bacteria, churning the milk. It was a quiet, rhythmic sound. Thump, slosh, thump, slosh. It was the heartbeat of the conquest. While the rest of the world was bogged down in the mud of logistics, the Mongols were light as feathers. They carried their hunger in their pockets, and they fed it to the fire of their ambition. They ate the steppe, and then they went looking for dessert. The horse is dying. Its chest heaves in a jagged rhythm, the white foam dripping from its mouth onto the dusty road. The rider does not look down. He does not offer comfort. He leans forward, his spurs digging into the animal's flanks one last time, driving the beast forward with a cruelty that is born of desperation. The station is just ahead, a low wooden structure in the middle of nowhere. A fresh horse is already waiting there, saddled, breathing hard, held by a handler whose face is blank with exhaustion. The dying horse stumbles. The rider leaps. He lands in the saddle of the fresh animal. In a heartbeat, he is gone again. The dying horse is left to collapse in the dirt. Its job is done. The message must move. This was the yam, the nervous system of the empire. A web of roads and relay stations that stretched from the Yellow Sea to the edges of Hungary. We like to think of the Mongol conquest as just a wave of horsemen washing over the world. But waves are chaotic. They roll where they please. The Mongol machine was not a wave. It was a body, and the yam was the bloodstream, carrying the orders from the brain to the hands and feet. It turned a disjointed collection of tribes and conquered cities into a single functioning organism that could react to threats with a speed that terrified the world. Marco Polo, when he finally traveled these roads decades later, could hardly believe what he was seeing. He wrote about it in his book with a sense of awe that borders on disbelief. He describes the system of postal stations, placed every 20 or 30 miles like beads on a string. He said there were thousands of them, tens of thousands. He tried to explain to the people back in Venice how a message could travel 200 or 300 miles in a single day. It sounded like magic to them, but it wasn't magic. It was simple, brutal math. You didn't stop. You didn't sleep. You just swapped horses until you reached the end. The station itself was a lonely place. Imagine sitting in one of those outposts, somewhere in the vast emptiness of the steppe or the cold mountains of Persia. Your job was to wait, to keep the fires hot, to keep the horses fed. You were the caretaker of the speed. When the rider came, you didn't ask where he was going. You didn't ask what was in the tube at his belt. You just gave him the best horse you had, and if you didn't have a horse ready, the law was clear. You died. The yam ran on fear just as much as it ran on oats. The rider carried a tablet, a passport made of gold or silver or wood, known as a paisa. It was heavy in the hand. It had the stamp of the great Khan etched into the metal. To a local villager, seeing that tablet was like seeing a gun pointed at your head. It meant the rider could take your food, your bed, your horse, and your house. You could not refuse. Persian administrative documents from the time are filled with complaints about the burden of the yam. The locals had to feed the riders, provide the animals, and maintain the roads. It was a tax paid in sweat and fear. The empire needed to move, and you were the pavement it walked on. But consider the tactical advantage this gave the Mongols. A European king might send an order to his border general. It would take weeks. By the time the order arrived, the situation had changed. The information was stale, but Genghis Khan could know what was happening on the other side of the continent within days. If a rebellion started in Bukhara, riders would race north, south, east, and west. The armies would converge before the rebels even realized the Khan knew they were there. It was a godlike view of the battlefield, facilitated by the lungs of horses. The physical reality of the ride was a nightmare of endurance. Marco Polo noted that the riders would wear a belt with pockets full of dried meat and dried fruit. They didn't stop to cook. They didn't stop to sleep. They would gallop to the next station, grab the next horse and keep going. A single message might pass through the hands of 20 men, each one riding flat out for an hour or two. The friction of the saddle would rub their skin raw. The wind would burn their faces. They would hallucinate from the exhaustion. But they did not stop, because the Khan was waiting. And you did not keep the Khan waiting. The Yam also allowed for a level of economic control that was unprecedented. Traders used the stations, cautiously at first. Then, with confidence, a merchant could carry silk from China and arrive in the markets of the Crimea without being robbed by every bandit between the 2 points. The roads were swept. The bandits were killed. The empire demanded safety for its messages, and that safety spilled over onto the goods. The Silk Road wasn't just a path for carpets and spices. It was an information superhighway paved with Mongol authority. There was a darkness to this efficiency, of course. The Yam was the delivery system for death as often as it was for news. When the order went out to slaughter a city, it traveled along these same roads. The rider with the golden tablet would thunder into a town, hand the scroll to the local governor, and the executions would begin before the dust had settled on the rider's boots. The speed of the Yam meant there was no time for mercy, no time for second thoughts. The order arrived, the swords were drawn, and the work was done. It was a machine of bureaucratic violence. The infrastructure itself was a marvel of low-tech engineering. In the deserts, they didn't just rely on grazing. They dug wells. They built shelters. They stored grain in depots along the route, so that a rider could grab a handful of barley and keep moving. In the winter, they had warm furs waiting at the stations. The system anticipated every need of the horse and the rider, stripping away every obstacle to velocity. It was a logistics network that wouldn't be matched until the invention of the telegraph. Imagine standing at a crossroads of the Yam at night. The silence is absolute. You can see the lights of the station in the distance. Suddenly, the silence breaks. A drumming sound, hooves. A rider appears out of the dark, moving so fast he is a blur. He doesn't shout. He doesn't slow down. He flashes the metal tablet. The station master runs out with a fresh horse. The transfer happens in the blink of an eye. The rider is gone again, swallowed by the night. The silence returns. But the world has changed. A decision made in Karakoram is now a reality in the field. The psychological impact on the enemies of the Mongols was devastating. They couldn't understand how the enemy knew their movements. They would plan a secret attack, and 3 days later, a Mongol army would be waiting for them. It seemed like sorcery. It wasn't. It was just the Yam. It was just riders dying in the saddle and horses running until their hearts burst, all to keep the flow of information open. The Mongols treated information like a physical substance, like water or grain, and they built dams and canals to move it. Even after the wars had settled, the system remained. It held the empire together. It allowed tax collectors to reach the far corners. It allowed scholars to map the world. It allowed diseases to travel with the same terrifying speed as the messages, carrying the plague along the same routes that once carried the orders of the Khan. The Yam was neutral. It carried life. It carried death. It carried trade. It carried plague. It just carried. The stations are gone now. The wooden posts have rotted into the earth. The wells have filled with sand. But if you stand on a high ridge in Central Asia and look out at the endless horizon, you can still feel the ghost of that speed. The wind still howls through the passes where the riders used to gallop. The memory of the hoofbeats is baked into the dirt. It was the spine of the conquest, the invisible wire that connected the mind of the Khan to the sword of the soldier. And it ran on the suffering of horses and the fear of men. A road paved with good intentions that led straight to hell or paradise depending on which way you were running. Look up. There is nothing else to see. No trees, no mountains, no walls, just the dome. A crushing, infinite bowl of blue that presses down on the back of your neck. On the steppe, you cannot escape the sky. It is the only constant. The grass turns brown and dies in the winter. The rivers freeze into white ribbons. The herds move, but the blue remains. It is the eyes of a god that never blink. The Mongols called it Munk Kuk Tengri, the eternal blue sky. And they understood something about it that the rest of the world had forgotten. The sky does not care if you live. The sky does not care if you die. It just exists. Genghis Khan did not build his authority on the blood of his ancestors. He did not point to a long line of kings or a dusty book of prophecies. He pointed up. He said the sky had spoken to him, not with words. Words are clumsy things. The sky speaks with the weather. It speaks with lightning. It speaks of the survival of the fittest. The secret history tells us that from the moment he was born, clutching a clot of blood the size of a knucklebone in his fist, he was destined to own the sky. But it wasn't a destiny of soft clouds and golden light. It was a destiny of iron and wind. There is a stone tablet carved with the words of the Khan himself, unearthed near the Onan River. The inscription is stark. It claims that he does not rule because he wants to. He rules because he must, because the sky has given him the strength to crush those who are arrogant. He framed his conquests not as acts of aggression, but as the natural order of the world. Gravity pulls things down. The wind blows the grass. The Mongols conquer. It was not a choice. It was a law of physics. Imagine standing in the court of the Khwarezmian Shah, a man who surrounded himself with gold and silk, who believed his power came from the rightness of his faith and the strength of his city walls. He heard the Mongol demands and laughed. He didn't understand that he wasn't negotiating with a man. He was negotiating with the force of nature. When Genghis Khan's envoys were killed and their heads sent back, the Khan didn't just get angry. He became the sky. He became the storm. He famously said that he was the punishment of God. If God had not sent him, why would he be able to do what he did? The logic was terrifying in its simplicity. If you can kill everyone, the sky is on your side. This philosophy removed the burden of morality. A European king had to justify his wars to the Pope. A Chinese emperor had to justify his rule to the mandate of heaven, which could be revoked by famine. But the eternal blue sky had no such rules. The sky supports the wolf who eats the rabbit. It does not weep for the rabbit. Genghis Khan looked at the wealthy cities of the south and saw rabbits. Fat, complacent rabbits who had forgotten how to run. He was the wolf, and the sky smiled on the wolf. The shaman, the holy men of the steppe, would stand on the mountain peaks at dawn, beating their drums and calling to the spirits. But Genghis Khan didn't need the drums. He felt the approval in the silence of the morning. He felt it when the winter storms broke early, freezing the enemy's arrows before they could be loosed. He felt it when the rivers dried up, exposing the fords that let his army cross. Every lucky break was a nod from above. Every victory was proof that the blue void wanted him to win. This belief system created a psychological armor that was impenetrable. If you die, you return to the sky. If you live, you are favored. There was no fear of hell in the Mongol heart, only a fear of cowardice. The sky watches. The sky remembers. To run from a fight was to insult the very air that filled your lungs. The secret history recounts how the Khan would berate his generals for being soft, for wanting to go home to their wives and yurts. He told them that the sky had given them the world and they wanted to give it back for a warm bed. The shame of that would burn hotter than any fire. The color blue itself became a sacred emblem. The standards that flew over the two men were black, but the spirit behind them was blue. The silk scarves tied to the spears flapped in the wind, carrying prayers up to the void. It was a direct line, no priests, no bishops, just the open air and the soul of the warrior. The settled civilizations built stone temples to house their gods, trapping them in dark rooms. The Mongols left their god outside, infinite, wild, uncontrollable. When the armies rode out to destroy a city, they did not see themselves as destroyers. They saw themselves as the cleaning crew. The sky hated clutter. The sky hated the confusion of too many laws and too many borders. The Mongols were the wind that swept the plain clean. They knocked down the walls so the blue could see in. They opened the roofs so the smoke could rise. It was a violent form of spiritual hygiene. The inscriptions on the stele speak of bringing peace through submission, submit to the sky or be erased by it. And there was a profound loneliness in this faith. The sky is empty. It is cold. It does not love you back. It just watches. Genghis Khan stood on the mountain of Burkhan Khaldun, hiding from his enemies, eating rats and roots, and he realized that he was alone. But in that solitude, he found power. He realized that if he accepted the indifference of the universe, he could become its master. He stopped asking, "Why me?" and started asking, "Why not me?" The sky did not answer. The sky never answers. That silence was the only permission he needed. The people of the book, the Christians and the Muslims, looked at the Mongols and saw atheists. They saw men who worshipped nothing. But they were wrong. The Mongols worshipped everything. They worshipped the vastness. They saw the divine in the sweep of the horizon. Their God was too big for a temple, too big for a name, too big for mercy. When the arrows fell and the cities burned, it was just the weather. It was just the blue sky turning black for a while before it cleared again. Think of the Khan on his deathbed. He did not ask for forgiveness. He did not confess his sins. He looked up one last time. The ceiling of the tent was closed, but he could feel the blue out there, waiting. He had done his work. He had stretched the empire until it touched the edge of the world. He had been the whip in the hand of the sky. Now the whip would fall. The hand would remain. The eternal blue sky would stay the same, watching the next Khan, the next war, the next pile of bones. Indifferent, beautiful, terrible, just the wind, just the blue. Rome was heavy. It dragged its history behind it like an anchor made of stone and lead. When the Romans wanted to conquer a place, they did not just ride in and leave. They dug. They laid foundations. They stacked cut rock upon cut rock until the land was forced to submit to the geometry of the empire. The roads were straight, flat, and incredibly hard. They were a statement. They said, "We are here, and we are never leaving." You can still walk on those roads today. 2,000 years later, the stones are still there, grinding under the soles of your shoes, holding the shape of a world that is gone. Genghis Khan built nothing. He laid no stone. He mixed no cement. If you look for his highways today, you will not find them. You will find only the empty steppe, the wind, and the faint scars of wagon ruts that have long since healed over. Yet historians call him the Rome of the East. They compare the Mongol Empire to the Romans because of its size, the laws, and the sheer scale of its control. But it is a comparison that misses the texture of the thing. Rome was a fortress. The Mongol Empire was a pulse. Rome was static. The Mongols were fluid. The Roman road was a spine. It was rigid. It connected point A to point B with a brutal efficiency that did not care about the hills or the rivers in between. It went through them. It cut them down. If a landslide blocked a Roman road, the legionaries stopped. They cleared it. They rebuilt it. The flow of information depended on the integrity of the stone. Break the road and the empire broke. It was a linear weakness, a vulnerability in the armor. The Mongol system was different. It was not a spine. It was a nervous system. It was a web. Historians call it a knot-based network. Imagine a net thrown over the world. The knots were the relay stations, the yam posts. The strings were the routes the riders took. But here is the difference. If a knot was destroyed, if a station burned down or a village rebelled, the net did not rip. The web simply tightened around the gap. The riders found a new path. They went around. They flowed through the open spaces like water, finding a crack in a rock. Rome prioritized permanence. They wanted to leave a mark that would last forever. They wanted the future to know they had stood there. The Mongols prioritized speed. They did not care if the road existed next year. They only cared that the horse could gallop today. The Roman road was built for the heavy footfall of infantry. The boot struck the pavement, the squeak of leather, the slow rhythmic tramp of 10,000 men marching in lockstep. It was the sound of order. The Mongol path was built for the hoof. It was a ghost highway, visible only to the people who knew how to look for the grazing grass and the fresh water. It shifted with the seasons. In the spring, the road might be in the valley to avoid the mud. In the summer, it moved to the high plains to catch the wind. The Roman road dictated where you went. The Mongol road let the land decide. It was a conversation with the geography, not a shouting match. Think about the sheer weight of the Roman infrastructure. The bridges, the aqueducts, the walls. It required engineers. It required quarries. It required slaves dying under the sun to move marble. It was a massive, static investment of energy. The Mongols invested their energy in movement. They didn't build bridges. They found the fords. They didn't build granaries. They carried their food. They stripped away everything that wasn't essential to the velocity of the arrow. They were light, unbelievably light, and that lightness made them terrifying. An enemy could prepare for a siege on a Roman road. They could block the pass. They could dig a trench across the pavement. You can't block the sky. You can't trench the horizon. The Mongol army didn't need a narrow strip of stone to move. They could spread out over a front 50 miles wide. They could come from everywhere at once. The Rome of the East was a Rome that had turned into gas, a Roman Empire that could evaporate and recondense 1,000 miles away in the time it took a messenger to tie his sandals. The comparison falls apart when you touch it. Rome was about law and order, imposed from above by the weight of masonry. The Mongol order was imposed from the saddle, by the threat of sudden disappearance. The Roman said, "Obey, or I will crush you with my building." The Mongol said, "Obey, or I will vanish into the distance and come back when you are sleeping." Both were effective, but one felt solid, the other felt like a hallucination. Even the way they are remembered is different. We walk through Roman ruins in Rome itself. We touch the cold marble. We feel the solidity of their failure. We stand where Caesar stood. The Mongols left no monuments. They left no Colosseum. They left only the genetic memory of a continent, shifted slightly on its axis. They were the perfect nomads. They conquered the world without owning a single inch of it. They used it, and then they moved on. The flexibility of this knot system meant that the empire could absorb shocks that would have shattered Rome. When the Black Death came, it traveled along those routes, yes, but the network itself survived because it wasn't physical. You can't kill a ghost. You can't bomb an idea. The roots were in the heads of the couriers. If all the stations in Persia burned down, the system in China still worked. The pieces were independent, modular. A Roman arch falls if you take out one stone. A Mongol web just loses a strand. The spider keeps spinning. It was a different kind of engineering. Instead of concrete and arches, they used timing and biology. The road was a living thing. It ate grass. It drank water. It slept. It breathed. The Roman road was dead, a corpse of a path that the living walked over. The Mongol road was a migration, a stampede that lasted 100 years. It was the ultimate expression of their philosophy. Don't build, just be. Don't stay, just go. So to call Genghis Khan the Rome of the East is a lazy shorthand. It is a way to make the familiar strange by comparing it to something we think we understand. But Rome was a cage. The Mongol Empire was an open plain. Rome tried to stop time with a stone. The Mongols tried to outrun it. And in the end, time caught them both. But at least the Romans left us some nice statues to look at. The Mongols just left the wind, blowing through the grass where the stone roads never were, where the knots have untied, where the net has dissolved, leaving only the vast, silent space, waiting for the next rider to find the path that isn't there. A woman walks alone. She carries a golden dish on her head, balanced perfectly, catching the dull light of the afternoon. She walks from the eastern edge of China to the western coast of the Black Sea. Thousands of miles, months of walking, and no one touches her. No one robs her. No one harms a hair on her head. It sounds like a fantasy, a myth. But in the middle of the 13th century, this was the reality sold by the Mongols. They called it the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol peace. It was a silence bought with blood, a quiet that fell over the world like a heavy blanket, smothering the chaos of war, but allowing the sound of money to travel further than it ever had before. To understand this peace, you have to ignore the conquering for a moment. You have to look past the burning cities and the skulls piled in pyramids. Look at the roads. Once the dust settled, once the screams stopped, the routes were clean. The bandits were dead. The local warlords were either buried or terrified. The highway was open, and suddenly a merchant from Venice could shake hands with a merchant from Tabriz. The world had shrunk. It had pulled itself tight. Go into the archives of Genoa today. You can find the dusty, crumbling ledgers if you know where to look. Stacks of parchment tied with a leather string. The ink is faded to a rusty brown, but the numbers are clear. These are the commercial contracts of the era. They are boring. They are mundane. They list bolts of cloth, sacks of pepper, and bales of wool, but they tell a story of a world that was suddenly connected. A Genoese trader signs a deal in Kaffa on the Crimean coast to pay a debt in Beijing. That is impossible. Or it should be, but under the Mongol sky it was just business. The safety was absolute. Ibn Battuta, the great traveler who came a little later but walked in the shadow of this peace, wrote about it with astonishment. He said you could travel for 9 months in these lands with a purse full of gold on your head and feel no fear. He wasn't exaggerating much. The Mongol legal system, the yasa, protected the merchant as if he were a sacred animal. To harm a trader was to harm the state, because the trader brought the tax. The trader brought the news. The merchant was the pulse of the empire. Imagine being that merchant. You leave the noise of the market in Kaffa. The smell of salt fish and sweat is behind you. You head east. You don't need an army. You don't need a caravan of guards. You have a piece of paper, a paisa, a golden tablet that says you are under the protection of the great Khan. Bandits see it, and they melt away into the hills. They know the penalty. They know that a single horseman can chase them down, or that a whole tumen will come if they touch you. You sleep under the stars, listening to the wolves. But you don't reach for your knife. You reach for your ledger. This was the first true globalization. It wasn't driven by philosophy or art. It was driven by the speed of the horse and the safety of the road. Ideas moved with the goods. A Persian astronomer could look at a Chinese star chart and correct his calculations. A Chinese doctor could read an Arabic text on herbal medicine and find a cure for a fever that had plagued his village for years. The mixing bowl was violent, yes, but what came out of it was new. It was strange. It was the modern world being born in the saddlebags of a mule. Think about the porcelain, blue and white. We think of it as the symbol of China, but the cobalt blue that painted those plates came from Persia. The clay was Chinese. The design was Islamic. The technology of the kiln was Mongol managed. It was a product of this peace, a physical object that could only exist when the distance between the desert and the sea was erased. You could drink tea from a cup that held the geology of 2 different worlds, fused by the heat of a global trade network. The Genoese contracts list these things: 10 pieces of blue ware, bales of silk, camphor, pearls. The items are exotic, but the language is cold. It's just math, debt, credit, interest. The Mongols might not have understood the nuances of double-entry bookkeeping, but they understood the flow of wealth. They encouraged it. They lowered the taxes for traders. They gave them status. They treated the market like a garden they were tending. Water it, protect it, and it will grow fruit you can eat. And the fruit was sweet. The empire taxed the trade, and the wealth poured into Karakoram. It poured into the coffers of the Khans. They built a city that smelled of roasted mutton and incense, where you could hear French, Chinese, Turkish, and Persian spoken in the same street. The peace allowed for a cultural osmosis that changed the way people ate, the way they dressed, and the way they saw the world. A European knight could wear a jacket of silk, lined with sable fur trimmed with gold thread from the east. He was a walking monument to the Mongol peace. But there was a price. Always a price. The peace was a police state. The safety was enforced by the constant threat of violence. You were safe because the Mongols were better at killing than anyone else. If a village rose and stopped the flow of goods, the Mongols didn't negotiate. They erased the village. The contracts in Genoa were written with ink that dried on paper, but they were signed in the blood of the people who resisted the order. The silence on the road was the silence of the grave. Ibn Battuta noticed this too. He praised the safety, but he noted the fear. The people bowed their heads. They stepped aside. They did not look the soldiers in the eye. It was a piece of submission. The world was safe because it was on its knees. The merchant could travel with gold on his head because the population had been beaten into submission. The bandits weren't just gone. They were dead, or they had been incorporated into the system, turned into the very guards who watched the road. The speed of the exchange was dizzying. A fashion trend in Baghdad could be seen in Beijing in 6 months. A musical instrument from the steppes could be heard in the courts of Hungary. The world became a small room where everyone could hear each other breathe. The Mongols sat in the middle holding the strings, watching the puppets dance. They didn't care what you believed. They didn't care who you prayed to. Just pay the tax. Keep the road open. Move the stuff. And then there were the things they didn't mean to trade. The things hidden in the caravans. The fleas, the rats, the sickness. The Black Death traveled these safe roads just as easily as the silk and the pepper. It moved from the frozen lakes of Russia to the warm waters of the Mediterranean, carried by the very merchants who were protected by the golden tablet. The peace ensured that the death could spread without interruption. The network that built the world also almost ended it. The final terrible export of the Mongol Empire. You look at the contracts now, dry, dead, just names and numbers. But behind every signature is a journey, a man riding through the dust, feeling the wind, checking his bags, wondering if he will make it home. He believes he is safe. He trusts the golden tablet. He trusts the blue sky. For 100 years, that trust was rewarded. The world held its breath. The goods flowed. The money changed hands. The maps were redrawn. It was a strange, quiet miracle, a pause in the violence of history, bought and paid for by the most violent men the world had ever seen. A golden dish on a woman's head, glinting in the sun, moving across a world that was suddenly, terrifyingly small. The snow falls silently on the birch trees. It covers the mud. It covers the bodies. In the years before the fire came, the land of the Russes was a loud, messy place. It was a patchwork of walled cities and river towns, each one ruled by a prince who hated his cousins more than he feared the enemy. They were brothers in blood, but strangers in ambition. They fought over thrones made of wood and gold. They burned each other's harvests. They stole each other's horses. The primary chronicle, the old book of the monks, lists these feuds with a tired, repetitive rhythm. And there was great strife, and they marched against him. It was a cacophony of small violence, 1,000 little wars echoing through the forests. Then the silence broke. They came from the east. The Novgorod Chronicle calls them the godless Tartars. The monks did not know what to call them, they just knew the sound they made, a low rumble that turned into thunder. In 1223, at the Kalka River, the Russian princes rode out to meet them. Confident in their heavy armor and their god, they were slaughtered. It was not a battle, it was a mistake. The Mongols let the few survivors go, chasing them back to their cities just to spread the terror, to tell the story, but the Russes did not listen. They went back to fighting each other. They thought the storm had passed. They were wrong. 15 years later, the storm returned. This time, it did not leave. Batu Khan, the grandson of the conqueror, brought the iron discipline of the steppe to the frozen forests. Ryazan fell first, then Kalamna, then Moscow. The chronicles describe the streets slick with blood. The smoke from the burning tormented the sky for miles. When they reached Kiev in 1240, the ancient mother of cities, they did not just conquer it. They erased it. The great church of the Tithe, the stone monument to their faith, collapsed under the weight of the siege engines. The domes crashed into the Dnieper River. The bells melted. The world the Rus knew ended in a week of fire. But the Mongols did not stay. They did not build forts. They did not move their families into the ruined halls. They burned the cities and then vanished back into the grasslands of the south, leaving behind a ghost that demanded to be fed. This was the yoke. It was not a physical chain around the neck. It was a heavy, invisible hand that reached out from the steppes every year. It wanted only one thing: numbers. The Mongols did not care how you prayed. They did not care who sat on the throne in Vladimir or Suzdal. They cared about the census. The very word was foreign to the forest people. They had never been counted. They were just people. But the Mongols needed to know how many of you there were so they could calculate how much to take. They sent the chislaniki, the counters, men with ink-stained fingers and cold eyes. They went door to door, hut to hut. They wrote down the names. They counted the cattle. They measured the land. To be counted was to be owned. It was a terrifying intimacy. The Khan knew your name now. And then came the tax, the vikod, the going out. It was a tribute paid in silver, in furs, in craftsmen. The Rus had to find a way to get it. This was the trap. The Mongols refused to deal with 100 squabbling princes. They wanted one man to bring the money, one neck to choke if the payment was short. This forced a change in the political blood of the people. The old ways, the messy democracy of the feudal assembly, the Vesh, began to die. You cannot argue with the whip. You cannot vote on a census. The Mongols installed their own officials for a while, the Baskaks. They lived in the towns, drinking the best wine, sleeping in the prince's bed, watching everything. They were the parasites in the heart of the body. But they were lazy. Eventually, they realized they didn't need to do the dirty work. They outsourced it. They told the Russian princes, "You bring us the gold. If it is short, we kill you. If you bring it all, we give you a patent, a yarlik. We make you the Grand Prince." It was a devil's bargain, and one man saw the opportunity. His name was Ivan. Ivan Kalita. Ivan, the money bag. He was the Prince of Moscow, a small trading post on a river, surrounded by swamps and thick woods. It was a nothing place. But Ivan was greedy, and he was smart. He became the perfect servant. He traveled to the Golden Horde, to the tent city on the Volga. He brought gifts. He bowed low. He scraped the floor. He offered to collect the tribute from his neighbors. He offered to be the bagman. The Mongols loved him. He made their job easy. They gave him the right to rule, and Ivan used that right like a knife. He did not just collect the Mongol tax, he used the Mongol authority to destroy his rivals. A rival prince in Tver? Ivan whispered to the Mongol ambassador that Tver was holding back. The Mongol horde rode, Tver burned. Moscow grew. It was a strange alchemy. The Mongols wanted to keep the Russes weak and divided, forever fighting each other. so they could never rise and throw off the yoke. But in demanding a single centralized payment, they forced the creation of a centralized state. To pay the Khan, you needed an army. To collect the taxes, you needed bureaucrats. You need scribes. You need roads. You need a strong capital. Moscow became the capital, built on the foundation of Mongol fear. The yoke lasted for 240 years. Generations lived and died under the shadow of the steppe. The Russian princes learned to think like Mongols. They stopped fighting with glorious charges and heavy cavalry. They learned to wait. They learned to use diplomacy as a weapon. They learned to be ruthless. The Mongol iron entered the Russian soul. The old freedom of the rivers was gone. The chaotic, loud clan warfare was replaced by the silence of autocracy. The Novgorod Chronicle, usually so chatty, falls quiet during these years. The entries become short. The princes went to the horde. The Tartars came for tribute. There was pestilence. The texture of life changed. The wood carvings became less ornate. The music became sadder. The people turned inward, holding on to their faith in the dark, wooden churches deep in the forest, waiting for the storm to pass. And eventually the storm did break. The golden horde fractured. It rotted from the inside. But the machine it had built in Moscow did not rot. It got stronger. The tax collection network that Ivan Kalita had built to serve the Khan became the government of Russia. The census takers became the administrators of the Tsar. The unity imposed by the threat of the whip became a unity of choice. You can see it today in the geography of power. The center is everything. The periphery serves the center. The logic of the yoke became the logic of the state. The Mongols came to burn. They stayed to teach. They taught the Russians how to gather the scattered pieces of a broken world and weld them together with terror and tax. It was a harsh lesson. The price was paid in silver and blood, but when the Mongols finally faded back into the dust, they left behind a giant. A sleeping, heavy, dangerous giant that had learned to survive the winter. The snow still falls on the birch trees. It covers the old battlefields. The silence of the steppe has moved into the stone of the Kremlin. The bells ring out loud and deep, but if you listen closely, underneath the Christian peal, you can hear the echo of the census taker, the scratch of the quill, the sound of a people learning that to survive, they must become one, gathered, counted, ready. Deep underground, where the sun never touches the stone, the water was singing. It was a low, steady hum, the sound of life moving through the dark. This was the heartbeat of Khwarazm, not the beating of drums, not the shouting of merchants in the bazaars of Urgench, but the silent, invisible rush of the Oxus River, diverted into the veins of the earth. They called them kanats, tunnels dug by hand into the alluvial soil, sloping gently away from the mountains, carrying water to a place that had no right to be so green. It was a miracle of engineering, a whisper of paradise in the throat of the desert. Juvayni, the Persian historian who watched the empire crumble, wrote about this land with a desperate love. He described the canals as the arteries of the body. He said the water was so clear and cold it felt like ice against the skin. For 1,000 years the people here had been digging. They had crawled into the darkness, cutting through the gravel, shoring up the walls with baked clay rings. They were fighting the thirst of the desert, inch by inch, and for a long time they were winning. The earth gave up its treasure. Melons the size of a man's torso, cotton that felt like clouds, grain that filled the storehouses of the world. You have to understand the fragility of this green world. It was not natural. It was a tightrope walk over an abyss of sand. The chanot required constant care. A single collapse in a tunnel miles long could cut off the water to a village. The silt had to be cleared. The windmills that lifted the water had to be oiled. It was a religion of maintenance. The Mukhanis, the water diggers, were the high priests of this religion. They knew the smell of the damp earth. They knew the taste of the water at different depths. They kept the silence at bay. Then the wind changed. It brought the smell of burning fat. The Mongols came not for the water, but for the control of it. They saw the irrigation system not as a miracle, but as a weapon. Genghis Khan did not just want to conquer the cities. He wanted to break the machine that fed them. He understood that in this land, the water was the king. Break the water, and the people die. It was a simple, terrifying math. The siege of the oasis was not just a clash of armies. It was a rape of the infrastructure. The Mongols rode up the embankments. They smashed the dams. They tore into the earth and opened the wounds of the Khanats. They didn't just block the flow, they redirected it. They flooded the fields with salt water from the river, poisoning the soil that had taken centuries to cultivate. The water that had once been a blessing became a curse. It drowned the roots. It washed away the topsoil. It turned the gardens into swamps. And then, when the summer heat returned, into hard-baked salt pans. Archaeologists who walk these lands today find the scars in the ground. They dig through the layers of time and see the shift. First, the dark, rich earth of the agricultural age. Pottery, grains, the bones of cattle. Then, a sudden layer of silt and debris, the chaotic signature of violence. And above that, nothing but wind-blown sand. The silence of the archaeologist's brush against the dirt is the only sound left where the water used to run. The tragedy of the silenced irrigation is that it cannot be easily fixed. A chanat is not a ditch. You cannot just shovel the dirt back in. The gradient has to be perfect. The air shafts have to align. When the Mongols destroyed the systems, they also killed the men who knew how to build them. The Conquests were slaughtered or driven into slavery. The oral knowledge, the secret formulas of the diggers, vanished with them. It was a cultural extinction event disguised as a war. Giovanni writes about the horror of seeing the water stop. He describes the canals drying up into mud cracks that looked like the skin of a dying lizard. The wheels that had creaked and turned for generations stood still. The orchards, which had provided shade and fruit, withered in the sun. The leaves turned to dust. It was a slow death for the land, much slower than the death of the people. The people died quickly under the swords. The land took centuries to die. The ecology of the region shifted permanently. The water table, carefully managed by the Chenets, dropped. The land that had been moist and fertile began to recede. The desert, which had been held at bay by the green walls of the oasis, started to march forward. The dunes, which moved like slow waves, swallowed the canals. They buried the brickworks. They covered the fields. The map of Central Asia was redrawn in yellow. The green spots turned brown. Think about the arrogance of that destruction. To destroy a garden is one thing. To destroy the ability to grow a garden is another. The Mongols, who were children of the steppe where the grass grows wild, did not respect the delicate balance of the farmer. They knew how to ride. They knew how to hunt. They did not know how to nurture the soil. They looked at the intricate web of ditches and tunnels and saw something they could break to prove a point, and the silence that followed was absolute. The sound of the water in the tunnels stopped. The splash of the irrigation wheels stopped. The laughter of the women in the cotton fields stopped. The land went quiet. It became a place of wind and heat and nothing else. The birds that relied on the water moved on. The insects died. The microclimate created by the moisture evaporated. The air became drier. The winters harsher. Today, if you stand in the Khwarazm Desert, you can still see the traces of the canals. They are straight lines in the sand, shallow depressions running toward the horizon. They look like scars on the face of the earth, ghosts of water. You can walk for miles along these empty channels and not see a living thing. Just the sun beating down on your neck, the dry heat sucking the moisture out of your breath. It is a haunting thought. The water is still there, deep underground. The aquifer is not empty, but the machine to reach it is gone. The knowledge is gone. The will to dig into the dark for 1,000 years is gone. The Mongols broke the link between the earth and the sky. They severed the connection that made the land human. Giovanni ended his chronicle with a lament. He said the world had grown dark. He wasn't talking about the night. He was talking about forgetting. The forgetting of how to live. The irrigation system was not just a way to water crops. It was a way of life, a rhythm, a promise that if you worked hard, if you respected the earth would feed you. The Mongols broke that promise. They proved that force beats hard work, that violence beats patience. The desert now owns the place. The sand fills the tunnels. The wind howls through the empty shafts where the water used to sing. It is a mournful sound, a high, thin whistle. It sounds like the land is crying for the water that will never come again. The conquest was not just a political change. It was an ecological suicide. The silenced irrigation is the loudest sound in the history of the region, a silence that has lasted for 800 years. And the sand just keeps blowing, covering the tracks, hiding the scars, waiting for the next time someone tries to dig. But no one does. The memory of the work is too heavy. The memory of the breaking is too fresh. The wind blows. The sun shines. The water waits in the dark, alone. The carpet was white, thick felt woven from the wool of 1,000 sheep, smelling of lanolin and dust. It was laid out on the grass, a square of pure brightness against the green and gold of the steppe. 9 men stepped forward. They were the most powerful warlords in the world. They were the princes of the blood, the killers of nations. And they were stooping down to grab the edge of the rug. On the rug stood a man, not a god, not a giant in shining armor, just a man in a heavy robe looking slightly nervous, his boots sinking into the pile of tilt. On a signal, they lifted. They hoisted him onto their shoulders, and the plains erupted. This was the Kurultai, the ceremony of decision. It was the moment the Mongol Empire decided whether it would live or die. To the outside world, looking at the maps and the armies, it looked like a dictatorship. One man ruling the world with an iron fist. But here in the open air, under the vast watching dome of the sky, it was something stranger. It was a negotiation. It was a blend of absolute autocracy and a rough, loud, dangerous kind of republic. The secret history tells us that when Temujin first took the title of Genghis Khan in 1206, he did not just grab it, he was raised. The physical act of being lifted on the white felt was the only constitution they had. It meant, we support you, we hold you up. If we let go, you fall. The Khan was the head, but the princes were the muscles. If the muscles stopped working, the head was just a heavy weight dragging in the dirt. Imagine the scene. There is no palace. There are no marble pillars or velvet thrones. The capital is wherever the Khan is, so the council is held on the banks of the Unain River or near the sacred mountain of Burkhan Khaldun. The air is cold. It smells of horse dung and wood smoke. Thousands of gurs are arranged in a chaotic spiral. The generals ride in, their armor clanking, their faces weathered by the sun and the wind. They have ridden for months to be here, because if you are not there, you do not exist. If you are not present to lift the carpet, you have no say. Rashid al-Din, the Persian historian who tried to make sense of this barbarian court, wrote about the chaos of these gatherings. He described how they would sit for days drinking fermented mare's milk, eating mutton fat until their beards were greasy, and arguing. It was not a polite debate. It was a shouting match. The old ways of the clan, where the eldest son inherits, clashed with the new ways of meritocracy, where the strongest leads. They argued about who was brave enough, who was smart enough, who had the favor of the sky. And there was a dark, practical truth to it. The Mongol army was not a feudal levy. It was a confederation of mighty men with their own followers. A general like Subutai or Jebe, or a prince like Batu or Kublai, commanded their own tumens. If they didn't like the new Khan, they could just leave. They could take their 10,000 horsemen and ride away. The empire would crack, The Kurultai was the mechanism to stop that from happening. It forced them to look each other in the eye, to get drunk together, to pledge their loyalty in person, where the spirit of Genghis could watch them. The ritual of the throne was a perfect symbol of their world. A stone throne is static. It sits in a castle, waiting. The white felt is portable. You can roll it up and put it on a pack horse. You can move the seat of power across a continent. The Khan didn't sit on a wooden chair. He sat on the world itself, carried by the backs of his nobles. It was a constant reminder that his power was borrowed. It was a loan from the tribes, and the interest was paid in victory and loot. When Genghis Khan died, the system was tested to the breaking point. The news rippled out, but the empire was too big. The princes were too far away. It took years for everyone to gather. The machinery of conquest ground to a halt. No great invasions, no burning cities, just the wind blowing through the empty pastures. The world held its breath. Rashid al-Din writes about the anxiety of those years. The generals guarding the borders, looking west, wondering if the empire would dissolve into civil war before a new Khan could be lifted. They finally gathered. The arguments were vicious. The family was fracturing. Ogodai was chosen, but it wasn't unanimous. There was grumbling. There was resentment. But when they lifted him on the carpet, the grumbling stopped. The act of lifting was a contract. Once you put your shoulder to the wheel, you are committed. To drop him later was treason. It was a physical trap as much as it was an honor. The drinking that followed was a ritual of its own. They passed the bowls of kumis. They ate the sacrificial horse. The shaman beat their drums, calling down the spirits to bless the decision. It was a loud, messy, chaotic affirmation of life. In the cold wind of the steppe, surrounded by the bones of conquered enemies, they celebrated their unity. They knew it was fragile. They knew that under the white felt there were knives, but for a moment they were one body. This ceremony of decision meant that the Mongol ruler was never quite a god in the way the Chinese emperor was. He was first among equals. He had to be a politician. He had to cajole. He had to bribe. He had to be the toughest man in the room, but also the most generous. If he stopped giving out gold and women, if he stopped winning battles, the Kurultai could meet again, and they could lift someone else. The white carpet was a two-way street. The silence of the steppe during these meetings must have been heavy. When the arguments paused and the shamans stopped singing, the wind would howl through the camp. It sounded like the ghosts of the dead Khans reminding the living of the stakes. The decisions made here on the grass determined whether the rivers of China would run red or whether the mosques of Baghdad would stand. It was the pivot point of history, and when it was over, they rolled up the carpet. They packed the tents. The princes mounted their horses and rode back to the four corners of the empire. They took the memory of the ceremony with them. They carried the authority of the Khan in their saddlebags. The machines started up again. The hooves thundered. The arrows flew. The conquest continued. But deep down, everyone knew the power was not in the Khan. It was on the shoulders of the men who lifted him. And if they ever decided to shrug, the whole world would come crashing down.